My journey into the space was through my son, Bertrand, who's now 10 years old, and who was discovered to be the very first case ever of an ultra-rare genetic disorder called NGLI1 deficiency. And as a consequence of that, I ended up learning a lot of genetics. And then in the aftermath of the diagnosis, I decided it was time to find therapeutics. And so I ended up learning a fair amount about medicinal chemistry and the process of drug development, and ultimately used that to find two repurposed therapies that work for him. So these are therapies that can be purchased today, that some are already FDA approved and given right now.
So my story began with my diagnosis with type 1 diabetes 31 years ago. And over the years, my disease became more and more complex. I developed complications from it. I currently take 16 different medications, use 8 different devices, have 13 different physicians. And it's that complexity and the difficulty of managing all of that and understanding that there are somewhat abstract biomarkers that determine whether or not I get access to certain medications, despite the complexity with which I live. That's what drove me into trying to create informatics platforms to make things better, to come up with a way of discovering new ways of doing things, whether that be in terms of making disease easier to manage for the individual, or whether that be in terms of making the regulatory process more responsive to the needs of the individuals and those of us who live with disease.
At the same time that I was in grad school at the Media Lab, I was also doing community organizing. So again, a big part of my story, I think, is is very much a political story. And so I was doing social justice work and community organizing the same time I was in grad school. And really, around 2008, 2009 is when the DIY bio movement really started to ferment. And I became aware of what was happening with kind of democratized bio right around that time period. And after my PhD, I joined Lincoln Laboratory, which is a Department of Defense funded laboratory in Lexington, Massachusetts, which is also my hometown. And when I was working there, in that capacity, I was starting to engage with the DIY bio community, actually from a security perspective, interestingly enough, from Lincoln. And so, it was around that time that, my interest started to converge. So we had set up a community center. We had transformed this Chinese language bookstore that my parents ran called East Meets West Bookstore. And again, my dad was a professor at MIT and taught electromagnetic wave theory. So his 3 favorite letters were E, M, and W. And so we created this community center, EMW, which again was focused more on poetry and the arts, music, and so on. And around 2011, 2012 is when we started integrating bio into the mix. So we started to do our own biohacking events and started organizing our own community lab, but in the context of this space that was really for underrepresented groups. So it was a really, really interesting mix where we had a lot of kind of activists and artists engaged at the same time with the folks that were getting into bio.
So, Patients Like Me was built upon the idea that people had knowledge that we needed to understand and we wanted to share. And so in order for them to feel comfortable giving us that knowledge and being able to provide an environment within which we could collect it, we needed to pay attention to some very core values. One would be that we believe that openness and data sharing was really important, and that in order to be able to feel comfortable doing that, we had to set it up in an environment where people could feel confident we would not misuse their data. We also had very strong commitment to transparency, so that we're always being very clear about how that data will be used and how it will ultimately be brought back into the community for people to actually benefit from. And then finally, it's really this notion of putting people first, understanding that really if people are wanting to engage with us, they need to have an environment within which we are honoring their trust. And so we've spent nearly 14 years, just really focusing on how can we do that as best we can, but how do we not do it alone? How do we engage with people and patients to come in and help us understand, inform us about what it takes to earn that trust? And that actually has formed the foundation of the company. Without that trust, we wouldn't have a company because all of the information that's coming into Patients Like Me to date anyway has been generated by patients themselves. They choose to share as much or as little as they want. And what we're finding is that they share quite openly and comfortably in an environment within which they recognize that we have been good data stewards. We have taken the information and collected it in a way that actually not only can benefit them in terms of learning, but they can also begin to connect that information to others and share. So that learn, connect, share value proposition ultimately is really, I think, what has fueled that environment of trust, that environment that we have taken some social responsibility to do well with their data.
The standard barrier first, which is money. Some of the stuff is costly to do. That can sometimes be circumvented, though, by partnering with people that have spare capacity. So partnering directly with scientists that have the interest and the motivation to do the work that you need done, and leveraging the fact that sometimes in these rare diseases we have really interesting model organisms in the patient themselves. They have real scientific value, and in fact, I think we owe it to the patients and to the suffering they go through to really learn as much as possible from them. To the extent that they wish that we do.
Being able to contribute the expertise and insights you have as an individual who lives with disease, it's that to me has been a huge barrier, because the other people who are at the table have lots of resources. They either represent companies or regulators, large government organizations or agencies, and there are a lot of people in the room who are incentivized to keep things the way that they have always been. So if you're coming to it from the perspective of somebody who lives with disease, who's empowered, in terms of being able to describe that, but perhaps doesn't have the backing of a large institution behind you, it's very difficult and takes a lot of time and commitment and stubbornness and personal resources to be able to continue to argue your point and to make the point that represents lots of other people, but just hasn't been taken seriously by the sort of established order of things.
Yeah, so what was important, along the way was certainly meeting other patients and then meeting the scientists. I think these all provided moments of inspiration, and meeting a lot of the patients happened because I was able to use social media to start finding other patients for this previously unknown disorder. And then finding the scientists happened quite naturally. We had this novel disease. We said, who's interested in this pathway? Okay, what do you know? And who else might know something else? And we sort of networked organically out from this core set of scientists until we found, the right group to really advance treatment for this disease, which included a good mixture of, basic biologists, geneticists, and actual translational scientists working on the medicinal chemistry.
A little bit of kind of structure would be very helpful, I think. And again, I think there's a real hunger for global collaboration. I will say that. I think that there's a real hunger to try and find projects where, again, the strengths of a distributed asynchronous, both asynchronous in time and space, network could be leveraged to solve unique problems, right? And I think that, in the near future, it would be really kind of strategically valuable for us as a global community to think about what some of those types of projects could be and leverage those projects to build, again, relationships with different types of entities from which we could have institutional support either from the regulatory capacity. Funding, of course, is a huge area, right? All of these different community labs are trying to figure out their own business models. And so to the extent that we can set up infrastructure to share best practices,
we would need to build upon a foundation that we had already created, where patients actually have trusted us to do well with their data. And then think about what do they now need to know as we start thinking about collecting biospecimens from them and how that kind of information would ultimately be used. So we did spend a lot of time engaging with our members, especially those from whom we would be collecting initial samples in conditions such as multiple sclerosis or in ALS, for example. And really wanted to understand from them as we start to engage you in this more intimate relationship of not just gathering your data, but actually coming and gathering a blood specimen from you. What are you most worried about? What are you most concerned about? So we really spent a lot of time just trying to understand the dynamic of that new relationship we would have with patients. For the most part, because we had already established really strong relationships with our community, patients felt very confident that we would, again, apply very appropriate types of methods to how we would do what we would do. It also forced us, however, to think about ways of ensuring that not only would we be doing this in a way that wouldn't be intrusive to patients, but would also give them something back.
There's so much knowledge and passion and understanding that nobody has bothered to tap into over the years. And part of it is a lack of insight, a lack of awareness on the part of people who work at companies or researchers that those of us who live with disease have a unique perspective. I think that's beginning to change. What we're hoping to do with Vital Crowd is to create a platform to make contributing that expertise accessible and doable for people who live with illness, who may not feel well, who at the same time have to go to school or work or care for their family. So it's really about making that process easier and sort of facilitating connection between people who have historically not been connected in a way that's meaningful.
If I could be working with a community biolab right now, what I'd like to do is to create an infrastructure for letting others interface with the biolab. You know, so for example, I think there's a large class of emerging citizen scientists that are able to start asking questions about their own health and about biology that they themselves don't quite have the technical skills to answer, but they know how to ask the question. And I'd love it if there are a way to throw these questions out to these community biolabs and say, who's willing to answer this for me? And can we collaborate? Can we find a way to answer this question? So I think some sort of platform for interacting with community biolabs would be phenomenal for accelerating citizen science and precision medicine.